So hello, friends. Thanks again for joining us. This is Steve Taylor. I'm the lead advisor over here at Merited Wealth, and you're joining me on another episode of the Do It For Yourself podcast. And really, this podcast, if it's your first time, welcome. If you've listened to it before, thanks a lot. We try to get ideas and have conversations with guests on this for other people that are kind of out there doing it for themselves, right? Their own business and everything. And so this one here, this topic is really interesting. I'm going to give you a little background. I'm really happy to have my guest here. I'll have him introduce himself in a second. That when I started getting into listening to podcasts, like, hey, what's a podcast about? His was one of the first ones that I started listening to. And it was really interesting. So I was really happy to get him on here. So without further ado, Matthew, please introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, Steve, thank you so much for having me. So as you pointed, my name is Matthew Jarvis. I'm a financial advisor based in the Seattle, Washington area. Excuse me. And then I also run a podcast called the Perfect RIA, which helps financial advisors, including Steve, do an even better job for their clients.
Awesome, man. Awesome. So let's go back, Matthew. I'm going to tell you, you have a very distinctive voice. You're awesome. And you're very, you speak
good sound
very
effects.
Well.
Yeah.
No, you do, right? You speak quickly, but you understand how you're talking, right? Which is great in this medium. So I, really, like I said, I found out about you right around COVID, around that time, right? I think it might have been you were on another podcast, and then I went over and started listening to your own. And you tell about the story and everything, but if you could go back, I'd like to kind of go through the phases of this, kind of what it was, what it's become, and as we go into this conversation, talk to us a little bit about, the genesis of when you started podcasting and developing this Perfect RIA, kind of like how that came about and why that came about.
Yeah, so about 2017, beginning of 2018, there was a gentleman in our industry, Michael Kitces, who launched his podcast. That was kind of in the earlier days of podcasting, and he called it the Advisor Success Podcast. And so I reached out to him and I said, Michael, I love your work. Followed it for a lot of years. Really excited that you're launching a podcast. I can't wait to hear it. Here's my story just about my practice. If you think this would be interesting, I'd love to support your show by being a guest. And he immediately reached back out to me. He says, I'd love to have you as a guest. I was his 7th guest, ended up being the most popular guest of that year. I was on a show again a few years later, was most popular guest that year. And I just told my story. But Steve, the way that I was able to get on his show was that introduction. I didn't just say, hey, Michael, I think I'm a big deal. Would you have me on your show, right? It was, and you did the same thing when you reached out to me, Steve. You said, hey, listen, I appreciate what you do. I'm a listener of your show. I'm a big fan. Is there possibly a way I can support you, or maybe a way we can collaborate, right? Versus people reach out, Steve, to you and I all the time, and they want our time, right? Endlessly, guys and gals are calling you. Steve, can I get on your calendar? Can I pitch something to your clients? And there's no value there. And so I was on that show. Lots of advisors reached out to me. They said, hey, I loved your show. It was really exciting. Would you talk more about what you do? And then my good friend, Micah Shalansky, and I launched the Perfect RIA podcast 2019, I think. We're on our 700th episode at this point. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, you guys have done a great job. You've really, and I've listened to it over time, and you've developed other formats in the sense you have recaps and different things you go through. So when Mike and you came together, what I really want to know is that you guys are, I know your story. I think you took over for your father and took it to the next level. I don't know if Micah's is a similar story, but you guys were getting together, right? And you say we're going to do this podcast. What was the goal of it, right? You say, hey, I was a guest here. It went well. People liked what I had to say. I now feel that there's more that I want to share. Like, tell me, what was that early on? What was the goal when you guys came together to kind of create this podcast and say, hey, we're going to try to help out other similarly situated people?
Yeah, it turned out that Micah and we met in 2018 after he heard me on the Kids' podcast. Turned out we had eerily similar practices, like Steve, in ways that we have the same candy dish and the same candy on our reception table. Like it's eerily similar stuff, even though he's in Alaska, I'm in Washington State. But we said, hey, listen, I wish there was a podcast that taught us all the things that we needed to know 15 years ago when we started our practice. And so really every episode has just been like, if I had a time machine, this is what I would tell Matthew Jarvis 15 years ago. And so it let us come with a lot of sincerity. Now, Mike and I also have a lot of ego, so sometimes that gets out of hand too. But it was just like, what do I wish somebody would have told me? Here it is. And that's really been our fuel. And I think it's the way the show so successful is we're just really just talking from our heart, as cliche as that sounds, to some younger version of ourselves.
So, what's interesting about it, because I'll give you mine where I come from.
Yeah, please.
I'm an advisor. I was an attorney first, right?
I saw that. Yeah.
Attorney for about 10 years. And there was a lot of benefit for me to go out there and speak to other attorneys about my area of law. Hey, I'm the expert of elder law. I'm the expert in elder law.
Yeah.
Can you send me over those referrals? And it worked great from other attorneys, right? But many times in our business, or maybe in other businesses, to go out and say, hey, I'm not intending to get referrals to build my client base from other advisors. Let's use our industry, for example, right? So as you guys were going through this, right, I think a lot of people, maybe why they don't want to become experts, they don't want to speak is, and I've gone through this. I'm like, how would building this, this podcast or talking to other advisors, how would that build my core business of financial advising, right? And I would love your take on that, because you guys have built the Perfect RIA. I know it's kind of a different business model of it, but as you were going into this and building that, how did you feel it was going to improve your core non-podcast business?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I guess maybe to peel that onion back just a little bit, I'll confess, and I guess people probably wouldn't think this, but I have a really deep fear of rejection. So I have a successful practice, I have a successful podcast, I have these great things, but even seeing you on my calendar, Steve, and I'm looking you up and I'm like, wow, Steve's an attorney and he's got this great background. He's got a really good podcast. He's doing all these things. What am I doing being on this guy's show? My imposter syndrome kicks in. And so it's like, hey, what am I doing? So then I think, great, well, what can I do? I'm going to make sure I'm ready to bring massive value to Steve so that even though he's 100 times smarter than me, he's going to say wow, I really appreciate you doing this for me. So I guess the moral of that is anytime that I can deliver value to another professional, that's going to come back to me. It's either going to make me a better person. It's going to make them want to reciprocate. And it's always grown my practice. Specific to my financial planning practice, I would go out and meet I still do with other CPAs, attorneys and whatnot. And the biggest thing I would do to show my respect for their time is offer to pay for their time. I talk about this in my book, Delivering Massive Value. So, Steve, if you were still practicing an attorney, I'd say, hey, Steve, I'm always looking for elder law attorneys. But I don't want to waste your time. I'm respectful of your time. Can I pay for an hour of your time and ask you a series of questions about elder law so that I know which clients are best to send to you? I can't lose because if Steve, tell me if I'm wrong from your experience as an attorney. If someone calls to offer to pay for an hour of your time, it would have to be a pretty weird scenario for you to turn that down, right? Right. Normally you got to ask them to pay you. And so I think, wait, I can't lose here. Worst thing Steve's going to do is take my check, answer my questions, tell me to go on my way. Cool. I can do that. What's normally going to happen is, Steve, you're going to think, no financial advisor has ever offered to pay for my time. Ever. In fact, most of them want my time for free, and then they want to come in and sell me something. It's a total waste of my time. And so I just took the opposite approach.
Yeah. And so as you guys are starting doing this and you're saying, okay, we're going to put the podcast, we're going to put great stuff out there, we're going to put good ideas, and it's going to come back and benefit us. Yeah. Are there any examples, or can you for instance, if you market, right, or you network, right, you want to track your time, what's the return on investments, all these different things. Have you seen certain things that as you've grown the Perfect RIA, right, this ancillary complementary business where you become an expert, can you attribute as that's grown or connect to similar to that growth inside your financial planning business? And can you kind of link together, okay, because how this is done well over here, that's helped me over there. I mean, that's always something that's interests me, and for others who may want to say, well, it's not worth my time to become an expert. Can you give any kind of examples to say, hey, this is how becoming an expert or being free with my time has benefited my core business? Yeah.
So the biggest benefit, and the one that's most direct, Steve, is so Mike and I get together every Monday morning. In fact, earlier before you and I recorded this, Mike and I recorded our episode. We get together every single Monday morning and we brainstorm on how to run our practices better, right? So just by putting I don't want to start my episode and say, hey, I'm the smartest guy that's ever lived. I want to start my episode and say, hey, you know what? I had this issue in my practice and here's how I solved it. And just by being reflective on issues in my practice, makes me a better practitioner, right?
Mhm.
Every episode I record makes me a better speaker. Every time I think, why am I running my practice this way instead of that way? Or in this client situation versus that one, each one of those makes me materially better. There's obviously a credibility boost as well. There's all sorts of other things, but just the repetitions make you better.
Yeah. And so that's what you've seen. So as you've gone through and you guys have had the RA, you have felt this, just the more you're talking about your business and giving it out there and putting these things out there, that in and of itself is making you a better practitioner. I guess not only what you're saying, but I guess you get feedback and you meet new people through all these different conversations.
Yeah. And my podcast is a little different in that it's like, because it's facing to advisors. So it's an advisor to advisor play, where similar to your practice, Steve, I work with consumers in my practice, right? And clients. So they kind of operate during different channels. It's the one is not designed as a lead machine for the other, but it makes me better overall. And of course, the Perfect RIA has turned into a multiple seven-figure company largely through the work of the podcast.
So let me ask you, let's pivot over to that, Matthew, because that's another thing that interests me, right? And that's another thing that as you grow this, so to go back and say, hey, listen, the value of becoming the expert is you're putting it out there, you're honing your craft, it makes you a better X, whatever it is. In our situation, it's advisor X, whatever it is. But now, right, you have this additional business that you've grown, and that's a successful business, right? So I think many people would say, whether it's our business or the others, say, hey, I like my core business, I want to share, but I'm maybe a little scared of this becoming the expert taking up too much of my time, right? And being focused on that. So no, I love this shaking the head. So tell me why it hasn't, and tell me why now, which you're telling me, it's two very successful businesses kind of side by side. How does that look?
Yeah. Well, so hopefully we're all familiar with Parkinson's law, which is that an activity will take as much time as is allocated to it. Said otherwise, your garage will always be full, right? Like there's your garage, no matter how big your garage is, it's full. So I have allocated time, typically Mondays, where the day that I work on the Perfect RA. That's when I do the podcast, what's on I guest on other people's shows. That's when I meet with that team. And so that stays confined to that space. And so it doesn't become all consuming. The other thing, Steve, that having this, I don't like to use the term expert for myself, but
you are. Stop it. You are.
Yeah, thank you. It allows me to meet people I would have never met. Like, let's look at you and I. Odds that you and I would have ever crossed paths ever in a million years. We're on opposite sides of the country. Like, it just wouldn't have happened. But now I have this opportunity to sit here and collaborate with you, and we'll probably run into each other at a conference now, and I'd be glad to buy you a beer. And these are introductions that never would have happened. Like, if I just sat in my office and said, hey, listen, I don't want to put my head out there, I don't want to raise my hand, you and hundreds, thousands of other people I now know, I would have never met except for this channel.
Mm-hmm. And so now, so you try to segment this, right? So you take this business is on Mondays, and then whatever it might be, and then your primary core business. I mean, that business is successful. This business is successful. How has one not crept into the other by limiting and confining the time spent on each? Has that been a challenge? Has that been a benefit? How has that been to try to keep each one in their own lane, so to speak?
Yeah, you definitely have to keep them in their lane. There's this great YouTuber. I definitely recommend looking him up, Evan Carmichael, fascinating guy. But we had him on a call one time, and he talked about the switching tax. Mm-hmm. So anytime we switch between different tasks, there's a tax that we're paying, this mental. And Steve, I don't want to comment on your age. I'm in my mid-40s. Switching between tasks becomes harder and harder, right? And so at first I would like meet with a client, then I would do a podcast, and I would bounce back and forth, and it was creating a real mental drain. Mm-hmm. So now I have very distinguished days. Like if we pulled up my calendar today, it would say, hey, today is the Perfect RA only, and tomorrow is Jarvis Financial only, and Wednesday is my flex day. Thursday I work on Retirement Tax Services, which is my brother's tax company. Friday I don't do any meetings. That's one of my personal days, and I'm very regimented about that. If somebody, if you would reach out to me, Steve, and you say, hey, this, I can only do podcast recordings on Tuesday, and I'd have to say, sorry, I just don't do them on Tuesday. Like, hopefully we can work that out another day, but I just have to be really regimented on that.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah. So now I hear, this is interesting, right? For those in our business, we listen to Michael Kitces, right? And he's involved in how many companies, and people say, how do they do it?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
But here you are. You're not, because I identify two, and you just mentioned your brothers, right? So this is the third, right?
Yep.
These are the different things that have come up. So, my next question then, following on the genesis of it is, as I've seen a lot of people in our industry go from advisors to being coaches.
Sure.
And I've not seen them do both, right? And it was always interesting to me because myself personally, I've never really hired a coach. Well, let me step back.
Oh, interesting.
They would say in the practice of law, right? For those that couldn't practice law, they became judges.
Yep.
Right.
Yep.
And so maybe that's stuck in my mind, wrongly so. And maybe you're going to tell me otherwise. I've never done a coach like who, because they were in the business. Oh, I was so successful, I had to leave it. Right. And so now as you're doing that, right, and you're trying to juggling, they say, I'm doing this, my core business is where the foundational. I have this kind of coaching, guiding business. How does that look? Where does your think? Do you intend to? You think it could stay like those two for a certain way? Do you think one will take over the other, or from where it started to where it is now? What is your thoughts on? Is it going to look the same with these multiple businesses, or do you feel you might need to segment yourself more?
Wow. Yeah. A lot of pieces in there. I share your skepticism of coaches. At the same time, I've probably spoken with a coach every week for the last at least 10 years, an assortment of coaches. Maybe some of those would be called therapists. I don't know, but let's go with coaches.
I'm putting coach on the check, Doc. Okay?
Yeah, coach. Yeah, I'm putting coach. And they're like, I'm not a coach. I'm like, no. We're going to put business coach here. I'm very skeptical of people who haven't done what it is they're trying to tell me to do. And so when I hire a coach, not ideally, they have to be doing whatever it is we're going to work on together. They have to be doing it better than I am. So let me give you a quick example. When we decided to launch the podcast, I said, who can I find that's making the most money podcasting that I can get a hold of? Joe Rogan wouldn't return my calls, so that was off the table. But there's a fellow, his name is John Lee Dumas. He runs a podcast, EO Fire. And he goes by JLD. On his website, he shows how much money he makes each month on his podcast, hundreds of thousands of dollars. So I emailed him my same approach. I said, hey, JLD, could I hire you for a couple hours of your time, just one-on-one, to tell me how to launch a successful podcast? Yeah, he messaged me back. He says, it's X thousands of dollars. I said, done. Here's the money. And we got on. And I said, what would you do? And so he told me, here's exactly what I would do. We did that. I've hired him. Really, I hire him every year because he's already got what I'm trying to get to.
Right.
So that's kind of that. To your question about what I'm going to do, there definitely, when you're running multiple companies, there's always going to be a conflict between them, right? There's always resource demand. I don't know how long I'll keep doing both. Right now it works really well because I can run my practice. I have a great team there. I can see what's really working. I'm really in the trenches. And then I can go to the hundreds of advisors I coach and say, hey, here's what I did last Thursday, by the way. And it worked or it didn't work. And I feel like I can come with a lot of authenticity. Right. Yeah. I can come and say, like, Steve, I don't know what should work. I'm just telling you what did work in my practice or what does not work.
Yeah. Interesting, Matthew.
Yeah.
A couple other things while we have some time, because, as you're bringing up these things, it's spirit. I'm getting different ideas and thoughts and things to ask you about. So your financial planning practice, am I correct to say you're the sole owner?
Yeah. I'm the sole owner.
You're the sole owner. Okay.
Yep.
So Perfect RIA, that's you and Micah, right?
Yeah.
Okay. How is that in these two different businesses, right? One, you are the sole owner, right? You make all the decisions. Over here, you have a partner because, many of us, right, that we're solopreneurs, we'll call them, or solo advisors, right? I don't want to sell. I don't want to have a partner because I don't know. How has that been that on one side, one of your business is just you and you collaborate, you're collaborating so well in these other businesses? Because I always feel I can collaborate well with other people and other businesses. Like we do this podcast, right? This is a collaboration. But with my business, I'm like, I don't know if I can give 10% away or something like that. How has that been as you go and work on these different businesses? That aspect of one, you're the sole decision maker, on the other one, you're working with partners.
Yeah, I'll talk about my work with Micah in just one second. I've had some really bad partnerships. I've had partnerships that ended really disastrously. I had a partnership end in a lawsuit. I've had some really bad ones. And probably if I had to make a blanket rule, I'd say don't take on any partners. But then on the opposite extreme, like look at Charlie Munger and Warren Buffett, right? Partners for decades. Obviously, Charlie recently passed away. But with Mike and I, it works phenomenally well. And I've been trying to really dissect that because I've had these failed relationships, business relationships, and I've had this one that works really good. And the reason it works so well with Micah is we both have an enormous personal and professional respect for each other. And so because of that, if Micah says, if I come to our meeting and Micah says, hey, Jarvis, last week I decided to do this, I have so much respect for him that I say, hey, whatever, even if it seems to me like a bonehead move, in his mind, it was the right move, and he would only make the right move for the company. Now, we still have to have some discussions. We have some boundaries where we say, hey, this is yours to take care of. And as long as it's working, do it however you want. And here's what's working and not working looks like. But it's not a silver bullet. Like if you think that 1 + 1 is going to be 4, it's not. It's going to be like 1 + 1 is -3 until you figure out a really good rotation, but enormous personal respect and professional respect is what makes it work.
That's awesome. So, Matthew, I'm going to do what you do, right? And I love about your podcast, but they're always practical. There's always like the takeaways, the action points, right?
Yeah.
So let's say if someone is coming here, let's say they're not financial advisor, they're the other business owner, and they listen to us and they say, okay, now I'm understanding. I'm listening to Matthew, what he's saying. I think becoming an expert. A perceived expert in my business may be something that I would want to do, right? So if someone does listen and say, I want to, go out there, I'm no longer afraid of being the perceived expert. I want to go out there. I want to market that way. What would be a couple steps that you would recommend for them to start doing now to start building that, we'll call it that line of credibility or that expertness?
Yeah, Steve, is a good question. Very first thing is to right away remember where you're not an expert, which is let's use podcasting as an example. So when when Mike and I record our podcast in the morning, we get on, it's all set up. I click on a link that's on my calendar. We go in there, we record our podcast. I hit done, and I never touch it again. Someone edits it. Someone puts the sound in there. Someone posts it on whatever. I don't even know how that stuff works. Put the show notes in. That is where I'm not an expert. And that's why I reached out to John Lee Dumas. Like, wow, you're the best guy I can find on podcasting. How do I do this? And then really, how do I find someone to do that? So I don't want to get burnt out trying to figure out how to use Riverside or Zoom or how to edit the sound or why the damn microphone doesn't work. I just want to talk about financial planning. So I want to remove any obstacles that are outside of my expertise would be the first one. Go ahead. Steve,
no, continue. Go.
Second one is, this is always a lot more fun to collaborate. Like if you had sent me a message, Steve, and said, hey, would you record a 30-minute blurb for my podcast and just email me over the audio? I'm like, dude, I don't really want to. But when you said, hey, listen, can we have a discussion about how business owners can get better at their craft? Yeah, I would love to have that discussion. So whether it's having a co-host like I've been fortunate to do, or Steve, like yourself, bring guests on the show, that's an incredible thing. And as we mentioned earlier, it's an incredible way to meet people. And you can do it, by the way, in your local community. Let's say that you're I have a good friend, a client, he has an HVAC installation company. They do commercial HVAC installation. And so if he came to me, we'll call him Bob. If he said, listen, I want to start a podcast. I want to be an expert here. I'd say, great, interview your vendors, interview your contractors, interview the city inspection guy, interview the insurance company, like anybody that's in your process, reach out to them. And just like you did for me, Steve, hey, listen, Jarvis, would you be a guest on my podcast? Most people have never been a podcast guest. Right? It doesn't have to be fancy. It can be a microphone on the table. And you'll just get amazing things. Again, like the code inspector for this client of mine, I'll call him Bob again. Let's say he hates the code inspector at the county because he's always giving him hell. Cool. Reach out to that guy and say, hey, listen, would you come on my podcast and talk about where contractors make your life difficult as a code inspector? This guy is now your best friend. Your best friend. You're going to learn some great things. He's going to be your best friend. How do you lose here? That's always my thing, Steve. I always want to play games that I can't lose because, again, I'm terrified of rejection. So I want to set it up so I cannot ever lose.
Yeah, no, I love that, man. You're going out there, these people that, when I was first, my wife started listening to podcasts. She told me, I literally didn't even know where the feature was on my iPhone, right?
No idea, yeah.
And I find it to you guys, I think you guys turned me on to John Lee Dumas as well, right? To go out there. And I would listen to certain people, they would podcast on their own. Right. And they would just, talk for 10, 15 minutes. And I'm like, well, that's not interesting. I don't want to do that. I don't want to hear people talking about me. So I will, and I will tell you that, yes, you hit it on the nail. Talking, this conversational, this interviewing format, this is fun.
It's fun. It's a ton of fun. This is
why I do it. Right.
Yeah.
When I hired a company to help me going, they had me do like 2 or 3 on my own. And I'm like, that's terrible. I don't want to do any of that. So I've taken it on my own. And so when you're here talking about it, it's just conversational. And I'm going to back up what you're saying also, that's what I do as well a lot. The guests, it's a strategy in the guests that I invite, right? Totally. You want them and you make it all about them rather than you, right?
Yeah.
And it becomes a very easy conversation, and they appreciate it, and you're marketing them, and it's very natural, throughout that whole process. And so if anybody listening here wants to do their own podcast, I'm going to take, exactly what you say and just add to it. Have fun with it, right? Go through. If you want to do it, if you don't like it, then don't do it. Do something else, whether it's writing or whatever you might want to be. If that's a route you want to go, do something that you enjoy. So Matthew, I really appreciate all your time, man. I'm going to give you this last question.
Oh, please.
And I base this a little bit off of Kitsy's, right? Because I started listening to him, and I found you.
Yeah.
And that's how you find all these people, right?
It is.
If you're interested, start listening to podcasts. And whenever someone refers you to another one, listen to that one. Maybe you like that one. Maybe you want to emulate that one. And so he ends it with, like, what does success mean to you, right? Mine's a little different, right? Because I've this long track record, and I go through and we look where we are now. So I'm going to ask you to go in your time machine,
okay,
and go back to Matthew of around 2016, 2017. I'm going to say prior to starting the podcast, not at the beginning of your financial career.
Yeah.
If you could jump in that time machine and go back to younger Matthew in his mid 30s. I just turned 50, man. It's crazy. In his mid 30s, and tell him something that you know now that you wish you knew back then, that would have benefited you and in some way. What would you tell younger Matthew?
What would I tell younger Matthew? I would tell him, and I would tell all your listeners the same thing. Surround yourself with people with whom you have a very, very deep respect. Now, maybe you can do that through a peer group, through a mastermind. Maybe you have to pay for that. Right? Like me reaching out to John Lee Dumas, right? Or someone, Steve, reaching out to you and saying, hey, listen, I need your insights on my finances or my business, right? But I've got to I wish I would have more quickly surrounded myself with people for whom I had a deep, deep respect of their expertise. Back to your original question of this episode, why become an expert? We all need those people, and they're really hard to find, Steve. And so I appreciate you putting your kind of neck out here saying, hey, listen, I'm gonna do this podcast. That's what I would tell myself then. That's what I tell myself now is surround myself with people with whom I have a very deep respect.
I love it. And I would just add to that people that you enjoy being around as well.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
If you like them and you have a deep respect with them, like I'm sure you have with Micah, it's not like you're not working. You're having fun. You're having a conversation. Matt, this was awesome, man. This was really awesome. I appreciate the time on there. We learned a lot. We'll be doing show notes, putting all that stuff out there. If anybody, can reach out to you, and I'm going to link to your podcast.
Oh, thank you.
If they're in our industry, they should follow it. And honestly, if they're not, if I could say, this is my second professional service business, there's so much to be gained from a lot that you guys teach that other practitioners in other areas could do. Like you said, you're very involved with your brother's CPA practice, and I know they have a great process there. So Matthew, listen, man, I really appreciate it, man.
Steve, thanks so much for having me, and I really appreciate it. It's a great show that you've got here. And again, I'll shout out again to your listeners to be able to reach out to someone like Steve that's got that legal and financial background. Is very rare. It's a lot of insight. A lot of advisors sort of just grasp. They sort of actually, Steve, I'll end with this. I'm sure you've heard endless attorney jokes, but this is my favorite. I tell this joke to clients all the time. And it's, someone passes away or they're dealing with the bank, trying to get like an account dealt with or whatever the case. I say, hey, listen, bankers are attorneys, but with their brains scooped out, because they always act like they know what the law is. You go in there and they're like, well, the law doesn't say that. The law doesn't say that. That's not a real thing. If I have to bring the attorney here, we will, but that's not what the law says. So,
I love it.
Yeah. Glad to have your expertise. Yeah. Take that one, man.
I'm taking 100%. I love it.
It's the truth, man. It's the truth. So the moral of that story is, for anyone listening, before you go to the bank with a question, call Steve, because he actually knows what the answer is. He's not some bozo that's on his 7th day down at Chase Bank. So
awesome. Thanks so much, Matt.
Steve, thank you.